Sanhedrin Daf Yomi Sanhedrin. Why protest? Íov sheshatak נידון ביסורין. The reason to protest when one needs to defend a moral principle or other people who are being disadvantaged in any way is not always because of the impact of the protests, but because of their humanity. There's something human about protesting. And although this shir is very relevant for what's going on in the world today, please don't draw any practical conclusions from it without talking to me or to somebody before you do. There were three people who advised Paro to do what he did to the Jewish people before the Shibud Mitzrayim. Elohein, these are they, Bilam, Íov, and Yitro. Bilam sheya'atz neherag. Bilam was the one who gave Paro the idea of killing the firstborn and doing what he did. And he's eventually killed. Íov sheshatak. Íov said nothing. He sat at the cabinet meeting and he didn't open his mouth. He didn't say anything. נידון ביסורין. He has a terrible life of suffering and pain. Yitro shebarach. Yitro got up and left. That's why Yitro fled from Egypt. Zachu b'nei banav leishev b'lishkat hagazit. His children's children landed up sitting in the lishkat hagazit in the Beis Hamikdash itself. The Brisker Rov asks, Bishlama Bilam, I understand that Bilam is killed because he gave the advice that makes sense. But why is Íov punished so severely for keeping quiet? It must have been a very difficult situation. You're sitting there with Paro, you know what he wants to do, you know what direction he's going in, and he's asking his cabinet for advice, and Íov doesn't want to give him advice to do anything terrible to the Jewish people, but nor does he want to oppose Paro. He realizes his life would be at risk. And we see how at risk his life would have been because Yisro, although he was at the height of his power and prestige in Mitzrayim, had to flee to Midian and become a refugee, realizing that Paro would kill him for intervening if he were to say so. He just fled, he just went. Íov sat there quietly. He didn't add to the trouble. He didn't add any bad advice. He just kept quiet. Why does he get this terrible life of Yisurim? And he answers, the reason that Íov did not intervene, that he sat at the cabinet meeting and kept quiet, is because he assumed that it's not going to help. Paro's made up his mind already, and all I'll do is make myself unpopular, and then I'll be of even less use to standing up for what is moral, because I'll be expelled from the inner circle, like we see happened in fact with Yisro, and then there'll be nobody in the inner circle that could defend the Jewish people at any time. Let me at least keep quiet and keep my position without getting into any trouble. Mishumachi shatak. And that's why he had these terrible Yisurim. Says the Brisker Rov, it's mido keneged mido. To show that just as when you're suffering terrible pain, chas v'sholem, God forbid, a person suffering terrible pain, they cry out. What's the help of crying out? Is the pain going to go away? Is somebody going to listen to you? Is somebody going to do anything about it to you? That's not what you cry. You cry because you're in pain. And the fact that Íov didn't cry out and didn't intervene and didn't protest out of pain, not out of politics. I understand that politically it's not the right thing to do. Politically it's not going to help to protest. But what about your pain? Don't you feel anything when Paro says, I'm going to throw every Jewish baby, male baby, into the river, we're going to destroy the Jewish people, we'll break their spirits, we'll break their physical being, we'll destroy them. Doesn't it pain you? Doesn't it hurt you? The fact that you could keep quiet, that's the reason that he was taught later on, that sometimes you cry not because of the effect of your crying, but because of the humanity of your crying. In 1952, there was a meeting of the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah in New York. And the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah is the greatest leadership, the highest leadership authority of the yeshivish world. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was at that meeting, Rabbi Aaron Kotler was at that meeting, all the great Gedolei Yisrael of the United States. And the topic they were discussing was whether to encourage protests outside the Russian embassy in support of the Jews of Russia. This is 1952, when the Jews were suffering terrible persecution. And the meeting was going in the direction of we shouldn't, because it's just going to make it worse for the Jews. If the Russians see that the Jews in America are demonstrating, they'll just turn the screws even tighter. We've got to find backdoor ways, diplomatic ways, whatever we can do, but not to protest publicly. Rabbi Shapiro was the Blozhever Rebbe, a wonderful, wonderful human being. in Brooklyn, New York, the Blozhever Rebbe got up and learnt this piece of Gemara with them, and he learnt it the same way as the Briskerov learns it. And he said, there's a time where you have to shout. There's a time where you have to cry out. Look what's happening to our brethren in Russia. And we're sitting in the comfort of New York, and we're busy thinking, should we, shouldn't we? What about the cry? What about the tzaka? What about doing something out of our humanity? Not necessarily because we think it's going to work. It's not our job to worry about whether it's going to work. It wasn't Eiyov's job to think, is this going to be effective or isn't this going to be effective? This is such a breach of humanity that you cry out from human anguish, not from political strategy. There's a time when your humanity overrides your politics and your strategic thinking. And that was such a time, and said the Blozhever Rebbe, 1952 was also such a time. It was interesting to just this morning, I came across a handwritten letter that the Blozhever Rebbe had written, and I analyzed his handwriting, and it is so human and so sensitive and so warm. You can just imagine a person like that getting up at such a prestigious meeting and saying, Rabbi, we're on the wrong track here. We're busy thinking about what the effect of our protests will be. We've got to think about the fact of our protests, the fact that as human beings we have to protest. And isn't that one of the tragedies of our time? How quickly the world got over October the 7th. And not to cry out and just say, this is not okay. This is just as a human being. It doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong and what will be and what the effect will be. Just as a human being to cry out, to see the videos and the reports of that event and not cry out as a human being. To not cry out for the hostages that we know are going through such a terrible time. And it doesn't matter if there's one there or there are 50 there or 100 there. These are Yidden, these are our brothers and sisters who are going through the most terrible time. Do we not cry out? And Reb Chaim Shmulevitz learns the Gemara the same way as the Briskerov does, and he takes it further to explain a Zohar in Parshas Noach. Parshas Noach, the Zohar says, Bo ata lateva, kivan da'amale deyishtaziv hu uvenoi. When Hashem told Noach that he and his family are going to be saved, loi bo rachamin al alma. Noach didn't daven for the rest of the world. He got busy preparing the Aron. V'itavidu, and the rest of the world was destroyed. Uvegin kach ikrun mea mabul al shmei, and that's why the waters of the flood are called Mei Noach in Yeshayahu. It's the Mei Noach because he caused the flood. He didn't cause the flood, everybody else caused the flood. He was the only tzaddik in the generation. Yes, but he didn't cry out. And says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, why didn't he cry out? Clearly he realized that there aren't even 10 tzaddikim, it's not going to help crying out. And what's wrong with that? He's Moser Nefesh. Afterwards, look at the Mesirus Nefesh. He goes to build the ark and to try and bring people back to tshuva in one way or another. And then his experiences in the Teva, in the ark, such Mesirus Nefesh from Noach, and he's talked of so highly. He didn't daven for the world when he knew that davening couldn't possibly help. Says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, you don't always daven because it can help. Sometimes you daven because you're a human being. And you care, and it bothers you, and you're in pain, and you're suffering, and that's why you do it. And it's important when we say the tefillos that we do for the hostages and for sick people, that it comes from a place of pain. It's all very well to say the tefillos and do the tefillos and do the tefillos help or don't. It's not our business. What's important is we're human beings, and we have brothers and sisters who are suffering, who are in terrible pain. And what kind of people would we be if we can go through our daily lives and not empathize at a painful, deep level and express that pain in a tza'aka, in a shouting out as one does, chas v'sholom, if one is in physical pain, one shouts out, not because it will help, but because that's what one does when one's in pain. So that Noach is punished not because he didn't daven. Noach is punished because he didn't feel enough pain to cause him to daven. And Eiyov is punished not because he didn't intervene. He was scared to intervene. He's punished because he didn't feel enough pain to intervene when he realized that the Jewish babies were going to be destroyed. That becomes the essence of it. The Orach Laner on the sugya has a slightly different take. Baruch Haneri, we've spoken about him before. the Rebbe, one of the main Rabbeim of Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And he talks about it's not only that he didn't shout out, that he didn't daven, that it's actually the giving advice. Sometimes you give advice, you have somebody's ear, and you're giving them advice so as to stand up for the right thing. You're giving them advice which is moral, which is ethical, even though you know this person is unlikely to take the advice. There are times when you don't, if you know somebody's not going to listen to you, you keep quiet and you don't give unsolicited advice. But when there's a moral issue that's hurting you deeply and you have the capacity to give advice to the person, that's something that one has to do. If you see somebody who's afflicting another person, you have to intervene even though the other person won't listen to you. And so it's not just about davening and about intervention. And the Aruch LaNer uses that to explain a difficult medrash, where the medrash says when Eov was suffering so terribly from his Yisurim, from his pain, they showed him a 3-walled sukkah. Kosher sukkah, it had 3 walls. What's that got to do with his suffering? What's that got to do with what goes on? And he explains that the sukkah represents this world, and this world has 3 walls to it. That is to understand that there's always an escape route. Another human being can't lock you in. To claim I'm a victim, there's nothing I could do. Well, you might be locked in on 3 sides, but always look carefully for the opening, because this world is a 3-sided sukkah, not a 4-sided sukkah. There's always a way out. And for Eov to look at his situation and say, there's nothing I can do. What can I do? Not my fault. That's not understanding Olam Hazeh. That's not understanding that this world always has a way out, is the way the Aruch LaNer learns it. Many years ago, when I was in yeshiva, I was walking very late one Friday night just outside Meir Shorim. I'm standing at a light, and unusually a car came past. It wasn't frequent that on a Friday night in that part of the town, especially at that hour, that a car would come past. And this car came past quite slowly, and standing next to me was an old Yerushalmi Yid. And as the car passed, he said in a low voice, Shabbos, Shabbos. And I couldn't help stopping him and tapping him on the shoulder and saying, Rabbi Yid, what was your intention? He couldn't hear you. And even if he could hear you, he's not going to get out of his car and start walking. What are you doing? He said, do you think I was saying Shabbos because I was protesting his driving on Shabbos so that he would change? It's not that he would change. I was protesting so that I don't change, so that I realize it's Shabbos. This is for myself, it's not for him. And we need to understand when we protest, whether we talk about protesting as the way it's understood in the simple means of today, or whether there are many times we have to protest. You just see something that is done, which is an avila, something which is done which is unjust, and we need to intervene. It's not always because of the outcome that we hope to achieve through that. Sometimes we need to intervene just to save our own humanity and to make sure that the inner pain we feel when we see injustice, the inner pain we feel when others are suffering, is such that it brings us to expression, to some form of self-expression, whether that's a shouting out, an oi that we say, or whether it's a tefillah, it's a prayer, or whether it's an intervention with some advice, something to do, but not to stand cold and unaffected by the suffering of other people. That's the humanity that we need. And with that understanding, Rabbi Yisrael Shapiro was able to sway that meeting of the Moetzes Gedolah HaTorah. They decided to support the protests outside the Russian embassy.